Miss Judy Kaner to address us. Bishop Graham.
Thank you very much indeed, and good to be here in Church House. I think you are here more often than I am, by the sound of it. I ought to say something, I think, about the pastoral letter, which is in print as well as available online. It was really the product of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, not something that I've had much affection for, that meant that we knew that the general election would happen on May the 7th for a very long time, and so the House of Bishops thought about something that would be more substantial and reflective than simply a brief letter outlining policies that we would hope the new government would implement. So that's the genesis of it. It took some time for it to emerge, and it is a letter to the parishes and people of the Church of England, inviting others to overhear it, and of course others did overhear it, and some of the initial reaction in some parts of the media was hardly favourable. But one of the interesting things is that despite what Damien says, as some people have read it, they have reflected on it and responded from both left and right and centre in a rather more positive way. It begins, of course, with a Christian view of the world, that the creation is good, that it is disordered by human sin, and that every government is defective. And that's, of course, one of the things that's worth remembering, that every government is defective. And yet we've got to have government in order for society to be ordered in any way at all. And I think one of the reasons for the letter arose out of, I think, the experience that I and many other bishops have had in our diocese. I think it's the first. I've been a bishop now for 22 years, and in the approach to this election, I've been very surprised by the disengagement with politics by those who are engaged in their communities, in community service. I've been surprised to go to food banks and find people who said they would not vote. I've been surprised that our youth leaders in the communities that they serve in our diocese, several of them said the other day they're no longer interested in politics and they would not vote. That's a new sort of disengagement. These are the people who are engaged with their communities, who in the past were engaged with the political process. And that's dangerous, and that's one of the reasons why part of the purpose of this letter was to urge our people to vote, to engage with the political process, even if they thought it was defective. One of the features of the letter, as Damien has mentioned, is that it does point to two post-war elections which changed the political weather, 1945 and 1979. I think there were hopes that 1997 would do the same thing, but I agree with Damien that it didn't, and I don't think that we're attempting to find a third way. What were the things that changed the political weather? Well, of course, it was beverage welfare, which of course risked an overweening state, and of course in 1979 it was the Thatcherite championing of the market, which risked an overweening market. But those two signal changes were counterweighted by the fact that in 1945 Beveridge's vision was balanced by a sense of moral responsibility, of personal responsibility, of family responsibility, which meant that he did not see welfare as something that would take away other responsibilities from family, individuals and community. And it's also true, although I didn't necessarily see it at the time, that the Thatcherite revolution also gave a great deal of emphasis to individual moral responsibility, to personal responsibility, and it had virtue ethics at the heart of it. One of the things that our pastoral letter seeks to do is to remind people that virtue ethics now seem to have very little part to play in our public political debate. In other words, there's very little talk of morality. It's almost entirely about the economy and who can manage the economy best, on the basis that we are seen as individual consumers who want to become richer. That's, it seems to me, on all sides, the appeal to the voter. And so there isn't much about morality, there isn't much about virtue, and there's scarcely anything about love in our political discourse. Now that might sound rather wet and feeble, but actually what it does mean is that we reject some of the things which mean the most to people in building their lives. That is, their place within their family, their roots, their religious traditions, their community life. And when you do that, you risk all sorts of other things. You risk getting your policies entirely wrong. I'll give you an example. It's not in the letter that really struck me. I can understand the need for welfare reform. My objections to the bedroom tax were not much about the money, but about the disruption to family lives. I can think of a family I knew where the couple were living in a 3-bedroom council house. They've been moved 15 miles to a 1-bedroom flat elsewhere. The man is disabled. They've got 2 children who they live on a council estate. They went to their local schools. These 2 children were the first in their family to go to university. But in order to save £27 a week, they have been moved 15 miles away. But the woman who was looking after a disabled husband was also looking after her mother, who was also living in a flat nearby. And as a result of that, she now has a care package which must cost the state about £200 and something a week. But what really disturbed me about it was that this is a policy which takes no account of family, community, rootedness, and the local traditions that actually sustain people's lives, their local connectedness. What we are pleading for in the pastoral letter is that we should not become a society of strangers from one another as atomised individuals, but that this nation is built up of a community of communities. Now, I don't think that that's based on some sort of vague understanding that we all like one another when we meet one another. That's not true. Communities, indeed families. I mean, think what happens at Christmas in those families when they come together. After 24 hours, they're desperate to go and get apart again. We don't all like one another in communities, but we learn to live together in communities. And actually, if we learn to live together in communities, we learn to live with the messiness of other people's convictions and lives. And a nation which is a community of communities, which is one that will be satisfied to argue across the community divides. And actually, it's only when we can do that, and that's why I think we've had 2 valuable contributions already. It's only when we're able to do that that we will be a nation worth living in.
Judy.
Hello, I'm not a representative of anybody, but I did spend quite a few years of my life as an Ofsted inspector, and before that as a national evaluator of government curriculum development. And a lot of that curriculum development came out of rather similar anxieties to the ones that panellists have been talking about today. Now, it's actually true that there was extreme technological change and great integration happening some decades ago. And it led to a situation in which the National Front rose, and there was huge anxiety in this country about whether open racist wars would break out in this country. There were things called race riots that happened in Notting Hill. Notting Hill a bit different these days. But the government thought that the answer was to pour money into projects to make children into better citizens and to inoculate them against racism. This may sound rather familiar to what you are hearing about today in government ideas about doing things to de-radicalise or to prevent radicalisation. Now, I want to say from the start that if you look at the history of these ventures, they failed dramatically. Government poured millions into curricular projects, And I was one of those school teachers and subsequently university lecturers who went out promoting them. The sort of thing they did, they devised various forms of classroom debates where children would be encouraged to look at evidence and discuss rationally whether racist ideas were true or not. Sounded like a wonderful idea. Let's make sure that we don't bring up a racist Britain. And that was being well funded by government throughout the 60s and 70s. Now, what we know about those projects is they failed dramatically, and not only did they not improve racist attitudes, but in some cases, doing these projects made the children more racist than those who hadn't gone through them. Why is this relevant now? I think we should not be too ready to tell ourselves that we are in some terribly unique period where there's change going on of a type that there hasn't been going on before, that there are new threats of a type that we haven't faced before, and that we have new solutions that are going to work which have never been tried before. Now, I'm not, on the other hand, saying, oh, well, you can't do anything, let's just let everything lie. But what we do know very well is that when government chooses to spend a lot of money on trying to influence national opinions, then we need to look at that very hard. And when government starts looking to fund various sections of the community to talk to each other, then we need to ask very, very tough questions about who is government going to choose, how is it going to fund them, on what basis will it fund them, and how will it check what goes on. At the moment, my understanding is that the Department, I think it's Communities and Local Government, has currently bids of, people can bid up to £400,000 to get together and do multi-faith programmes which are designed to promote de-radicalisation. And among the groups developing bids are the apparent representatives of the Jewish community, the Board of Deputies, and I believe such organisations as the Muslim Council of Britain. Now, these are organisations that formally have representation, which they claim is representative of their communities as a whole. And I can say that if you look carefully at these bodies, they are not genuinely representative of the vast majority of people they claim to represent. Because one of the characteristics of our current age, as it was in a different way in the 60s and 70s, is that we have very well developed political campaigns and political campaigners who seek, by a process called entryism, to capture or take on the mantle of communities of which they are an unrepresentative part and speak for them. And I think in the case of the Jewish community, there's a very interesting illustration of that. The current leadership of the Board of Deputies very, very strongly supports partnership with the Muslim Council of Britain. The mainstream Jewish community really does not, and there's an interesting demonstration of the evidence of that in the current Jewish Chronicle. The Jewish Chronicle had a very bad record of doing totally valueless polls of public opinion, and they were chastened to that to the extent that they have at last begun to do some reasonable polls. And the most recent poll they did discovered that 65% of the Jewish population in this country would vote for Mr. Netanyahu. Now, Mr. Netanyahu is perceived by the Board of Deputies and the mainstream liberal establishment of this country as some sort of dangerous monster freak, a threat to world peace. So all I'm doing is I'm not trying to make the case for any of these people, but what I'm saying is they aren't representative, and government really has no business, in my view, in deciding who represents Jews and who represents Muslims, or who represents Hindus, unless they do a very great deal of due diligence. And the due diligence wouldn't just mean what's in these very nice proposals they put together for £400,000 of public money. What is their track record? Now, our friend at the back talked about something called non-violent Islamism. Theoretically, there is such a thing. It's what I call Islamists in suits. But actually, all it is Islamism for export, because they do support violence. There are no Islamists that I know of worldwide who don't support extreme violence somewhere or other. And the most common locuses for that Islamism are Pakistan, Egypt, Sudan, and Israel. And those very, very Islamists who want to hold hands with the Board of Deputies, want to see the state of Israel brought to an end and its Jews expelled. But you know that sort of story, and I don't want to overplay it. But I don't think government has any business in putting money into legitimating Islamists or people with particular political agendas within other faiths. And much as I respect the Church of England and admire it and have worked with it in interfaith projects and greatly admired the best of its schools, when I hear a bishop talking about the bedroom tax, I think that's adopting specific Labour terminology. Why is that happening? Why is the agenda so close to that of one political party? If you listen to the Board of Deputies, they've produced something called a Jewish agenda for the election. It's entirely full of Labour Party terminology and Labour Party talking points, because people from within those sections have gained control of the Board of Deputies. So I think we have in this country at this time a great deal of different types of entryism. That is, the taking over of groups like religious communities and other sorts of cultural communities in the name of a faith group or an interest group, but it's actually a cover for a highly unrepresentative group. We know about that historically because it happened in the unions. The overwhelming majority of our public sector unions are now controlled by people who are in the Socialist Workers' Party, and the government would not dream of inviting members of the Socialist Workers' Party to come along and advise it on promoting this or that or the other attitude towards society. We recognise entryism as it has affected and captured most of our trade unions. We're not sufficiently aware of the extent to which it's in play in our faith organisations. And we need, before we even think of supporting any government handouts of money to faith organisations claiming that they're going to do wonderful things, to say, where is your track record? Where is your proof that you have actually done anything to change anybody? And where are you proposing to spend this money? And what is the track record? Not just in this country, but overseas. Because I'm not only against violence in this country, I'm against the use of government money to provoke violence in any country. And with that, I will finish.
Thank you. Bravo! Very evocative points of view, and potentially some questions now.
I was greatly encouraged actually by a number of opinions, and I think some very good points come out across the panel. I'm someone who's lived in the inner city of London for 65 years now, been a member of the Church of England for about 45, and a licensed lecturer there. So I'm involved in the community, involved in business throughout my career. I think that one of the things we've got to think about in terms of the general election, because that was part of the mandated discussion, I think we must always remember that as human beings, there is more we have in common than we have what is not in common. So that basically, there should always be a fundamental optimism in terms of our community and civic responsibility. We've heard quite a lot about the failings of government on foreign policy, but I think where I would applaud an interfaith forum, and certainly one that can have dialogue with government, because we're actually at a time we may not be seeing anything new within our society, but what we are seeing is a new opportunity to actually act vicariously, not only in the faith realm, but also in the civic realm. I'm outgoing Vice Chair of one of the London Chambers of Commerce. And I would say to you that there is an enormous field of opportunity, which I would put a challenge to the Interfaith Forum to say, let's take up this dialogue, let's unite together for the sake of human dignity, for the sake of bringing together disparate humanity. Because one of the things that Damien has said, which is very important, and he's highlighted the effect of globalization, he's highlighted the effect of technology, and he's highlighted the effect of a rapidly changing culture. Now, those are scenarios which beg a coming together, a working together in unity to create a new dynamic within our communities. We are representatives of established communities, not fringe communities, established communities. And we have an enormous opportunity to work together, because one of the things that faith communities does is actually brings together people out of isolation, people that through technology, through radical change, are isolated, through economic disadvantage, are lonely and isolated. Faith community brings an opportunity for these people to be taken into a real society out of their isolation. So therefore I would plead to you, if you are going to set up and energise for this forum, that you would actually work on these challenges, because we can make a difference. There is more that unites us than that which doesn't.
Thank you very much for that. As time marches on, I'm going to ask each of our speakers. I think that will be the only question. There will be space and headroom at the end, after the summing up, for some further interaction and questions. That will be the question, and I turn to our speakers if they wish to comment.
I'm bursting to say 2 or 3 things. First of all, bravo, Judy. I didn't imagine I would come here today and hear such a brilliant and forensic discussion of the politics of entryism and your analogy between that which we spot very easily in the political or trade union sphere and that which we have failed to spot in the religious sphere, and also the fact that you recognise it happening in your own community, not just other communities. I will stress, that sounds pompous, but I will just say on the record that I think that Who is My Neighbour is a poor piece of work. The fact that we had a fixed term parliament and therefore a number of years in which to prepare it makes it all the more disappointing that it should not only reflect woolly thinking but be written in barbarously clumsy prose. It's full of jargon. There are references to subsidiarity. As soon as I hear that word, being a Catholic, I'm very used to the word subsidiarity. I smell, I won't say the word, but you can imagine what I sniff. Subsidiarity. It is a papal teaching. It is a papal teaching, and it is invoked by. It is invoked incessantly every time the Bishops' Conference sits around for one of its comfortable self-congratulatory sessions. It is, in a way, subsidiarity that allowed the Catholic Church to get away with the monstrous child abuse for so many decades, because power was devolved, if you like, to the parish and the parish priests whom people trusted. It is subsidiarity that has allowed the grooming scandal, the idea which the disappointing report seems to be supporting, that power should be devolved to faith leaders, well, we've already heard it, let's remind ourselves that these faith leaders are unelected, and it is thanks to unelected faith leaders, above all, that the Rotherham grooming scandal was allowed to continue for such a disgracefully long period of time. I do not buy the idea. Like Judy, I was dismayed to hear the bishop, but not surprised, to hear the bishop use a piece of Labour jargon when he referred to the bedroom tax. I was also not surprised that there was no reference whatsoever to the fact that whether or not he's made a success of it, and in many ways he has, Ian Duncan Smith worked extremely hard at a moral response to the problem of welfare dependency, drawing on the work done by his Centre for Social Justice. No politician has thought longer and harder about the morality of governing. David Cameron has addressed it too. I feel that his Big Society project was perhaps a little naive, but one of the reasons it didn't work is that he got very, very little support from a Church of England and a Roman Catholic Church who simply don't like engaging with Tories. Let's be frank about that. The Big Society might have worked.
That is simply not true.
Well, having spent many years as a religious affairs correspondent, as the editor-in-chief of a religious newspaper, the distaste of clerics for dealing with conservatives is something that comes across very, very powerfully, even when they're assuring you to the contrary. And you only have to read the document to see that to see evidence of that. So I don't buy the prescriptions, but I am enormously heartened to hear both Mohammed and Judy draw attention to the very, very alarming dangers that await if we persist in this naivety.
Yeah. Can I turn to Bishop Graham for a retort on that?
Well, Who is My Neighbour actually commends the Big Society and says that it is a great pity that it wasn't stayed with. And the very first parliamentary debate in the House of Lords supporting the Big Society was sponsored indeed by the Bishop of Leicester. And if you actually go back, Damien, to that debate, you will see plenty of evidence of the way in which the Big Society was supported.
Well, why don't you ask Conservative politicians how much support they got from the Church of England? I think you'll find that the answer is...
They got plenty of it. They got plenty of it if they'd pursued it.
If they'd pursued it?
Well, they didn't pursue it enough. I mean, actually, who was engaged in the Big Society? I mean, one of the things that's so striking about the last few years, I look in my own diocese, there are no longer any community youth workers employed out of the public purse. That may be a perfectly good thing. Actually, it's only the churches who are now employing them. I mean, we've now got 28 of them employed by the Diocese of Norwich. We only had 3 15 years ago. There's all sorts of work that's coming back to create a Big Society that's again being done by the churches, including your own church. So I don't buy this fact. It's not the rhetoric of what you say in support, it's what churches do. And the churches are still there in local communities. Only yesterday I was opening a community cafe on one of our most difficult council estates, which has been opened by the people of that community in their church because there is no other drop-in facility. The drop-in facility meets the needs of people with mental illness.
I'm not denying that you do a lot of good work on the ground.
All of those things are happening.
What I'm saying is that when bishops make public statements, the message, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and 2 successive Archbishops of Canterbury's, the message is basically the same, which is spend more money and everything will be all right.
That actually isn't. If any of you have read this, you will know that's not what it says. What it says is pay attention to family, to traditions, to communities, and actually recognise that within our society it's the intermediate institutions, to use the old jargon, that actually...
Well, it would have been nice if you'd paid a little bit of attention to the intense work by Ian Duncan Smith and many other think tanks who are trying to construct...
Gentlemen, yeah,
all right.
We're going to. This is a debate within a debate, within a debate.
Good.
And,
I'm glad.
which has enormous value, but we must continue. And finally, and we're overrun on time, so I turn to Judy to make a final pithy comment on the questions raised.
I don't know if Martin can get the image up that I sent him earlier, but I wanted to take up what our friend over here said about we need to have dialogue about what we have in common and build on that. And I'm going to say that I think that's extremely dangerous, because that is a way in which those entryist groups present themselves as motherhood and apple pie, full of goodness and good intentions. I don't know if you've been following the Cage scandal, but this is exactly the technique that such organisations used with Islamist radicals. They were always presented as thoroughly nice guys who were only trying to help their community, and somehow mysteriously they end up being killed or killing out in Syria. If we say we must focus on what we have in common, then you provide a space for projects like, let's hold hands in front of synagogues to show what really good guys we are. And that sounds wonderful, and it takes in loads of Jews. I can show you dozens and dozens and dozens of comments in the Israeli and British press that are over the moon that some little groups of Muslims have decided to stand holding hands outside synagogues to protect synagogues. What we have in common. Let's all go and observe our religions. But if you do the due diligence, you'll find out that these Islamists, who they are nothing of the sort. They are promoting the idea of everything being under control of the caliphate, where synagogues and churches are protected, under their protection, on their terms. And if you try and challenge that, wait and see what a load of attacks. You know, I've been attacked. I said, you are such an arsehole for trying to raise the issue as to what really stood behind these people. If you look at who they follow, now that is an image, and unfortunately you can't see it as well as you should be able to do, but it's a Muslim man and woman standing in front of the Star of David, and it really does look like motherhood and apple pie. What it says on the notice, and I think any political message that's being portrayed through held up bits of paper and hashtags is totally suspicious. This is not serious politics. It's icing, it's nail varnish politics. You don't know anything about what it means till you look at the groups behind it. Now that says, go to synagogue, we must stick together. Who are these Muslims telling Jews what to do? You know, if I'm the Jewish community, I want to be consulted about what I want and who I want to deliver my security. Now this looks like a nice young chap and a nice young woman. You might think they're students. Well, actually the guy is a leading figure in the Association of German Muslim lecturers and students, and the woman is a leading figure in the European Association of Muslims in Council with Jews. This tells you they are politicised figures. They're there for a political purpose. Now there's been a whole outbreak of these apparently wonderful hand-holding organisations. They only started, snap, out of the blue, after some Islamists went and machine gunned Jews in a kosher supermarket and went and stabbed a guy who's a friend of mine, as it happens, guarding a synagogue. And suddenly here's all these wonderful demonstrations of motherhood and apple pie which take people in. No, they're not. You need to look below the surface, standing together and holding hands in dialogue without asking any further questions. Who are these people? Where are they coming from? Who's funding them? What are their real purposes? My own community is all too ready to be pathetically grateful that they don't want to kill us. They want to tell us to go to synagogue. Sorry, that's not enough. I don't want anybody outside my synagogue who wants my relatives in Israel killed. I don't want anybody outside my synagogue who wants homosexuals flung off the top of towers. This is not a base saying, let's just look at what we have in common and stop talking about the very different real political objectives. No, that is extremely dangerous, and no way should government be funding it or encouraging it or saying that's the answer. And I'm afraid, I don't know if Martin can help. I've got one more.
Can we actually curtail till the
What a
end?
blast of common sense,
Okay,
though.
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, but
That
I've
is
got one more image
very-
to show you.
As important as that is, I'm tasked, unfortunately, with moving this on and respecting the next pair of speakers, and therefore we will have opportunity, hopefully, in the closing minutes to revisit this. I'm now going to turn to Brendan O'Neill.
Brendan was not able to make it because he was ill.
Such a shame.
Grateful.
So he apologised very much, but he's lost his voice.
And I do apologise for not spotting that. Then I turn to Pundit Satish Sharma, and I hand over to you and understand that you'll be summing up, after which we shall reopen the debate.
Thank you very much, Chair. We've all been listening for quite some time, and I'm sure that we're keen to get to the conclusions and take what we've learned and experienced with us to mull over. So I'm not going to take too long. But before I do continue, I think it's probably worth me placing my credentials before you in light of many of the things that have been said. I'm a trustee of Slough Temple, and we appoint our trustees by election. The elected members of the temples of this country are then elected again to represent their communities on a council. So we go through 2 stages of election, and so I am an elected representative of our community. Secondly, I'm not paid, I'm here as a volunteer, so what I'm doing is because I think this is so critical for this country at this particular point in time. By way of introduction, I've come into this interreligious space involuntarily. My background is in accounting, auditing, management consulting, and supporting 1 or 2 charities associated with Hindus and Hinduism in this country. And so my approach to all of this has been professionally irreligious. I am not a professional religious person, but I am a fairly spiritual person, and I have studied a degree of our Indian literature and also the Western religious literature. And I'm going to try and contribute something which is purely and solely from a dharmic faith perspective, and from the perspective of a minority religion in this country, and the reality of engaging with a majority religion. And I'm going to touch on very, very specifics. I'm hoping that when we leave here, not only have we had exposure to a number of policy and blue sky thinking concepts, but also some very specific issues which I feel are fundamental to interfaith harmony, and which I feel are far too easily glossed over just to maintain the status quo. Just to emphasise, in my own mind, I have no doubt at all that the most critical aspect that we have to face is to overcome interfaith friction. When that cascades out of control, we have seen how quickly it destroys civilizations, countries and nations, and we are seeing that now. Even records of former civilizations are being obliterated because religious hatred is out of control. If we don't get this right, all of the policies about economics and the public sector borrowing requirement, they vanish in days, if not weeks, when this issue gets out of control. So this is, I believe, the highest goal that faces us. Also, here in England, we've actually got the benefit of a degree of stability for a long period of time. The country has had a chance to maintain harmony and stability and put into place institutions and mechanisms of democratic engagement which are not present in many other countries. And so we have got an incredible opportunity to try and use those institutions and step over the issues of faith conflict. So I'm actually very, very positive about that. One comment was made about immigration having forced so many religions, peoples, cultures together. And it was presented as, I felt, a little bit negative. But I think there's a very positive aspect to it spiritually. I think spiritually, there are issues which are fault lines between belief systems, And there's nothing like throwing diverse people together into a space where they cannot escape to resolve those basic fundamental fault lines. We have to do this, and we can do this here within the British paradigm. So I'm very, very positive about that. When my father came here, he left, he was the personal assistant to the President of India. When he came here for education, got a look for work, the only work he could find was as a bus conductor, because it was common knowledge that Indians could not control a vehicle at a speed higher than 30.